At school, we're taught to believe everything we read in the textbooks. But what about the stuff that doesn't make the cut? Covering all bases throughout photographic history, from the mind-blowing status quo disruptors to the head-scratchingly bizarre, let's check out some of the photos they won't show you in the history books. Flight to the past. School books only usually tell us about the big events that happen throughout history, but often it's the small details that are the most interesting. For example, today we've come to expect a certain level of comfort on flights, from reclining seats to in-flight entertainment. But back in the 1930s, when commercial airlines were still relatively new, flight cabins were much more basic. This particular type of aircraft boasted a total passenger capacity rarely exceeding a dozen, each with their own wicker chair bolted to the floor. I don't think I'll ever complain about modern airline seats being uncomfortable again. Baby Zoomers. Sometimes it seems world-class athletes are getting younger and younger, but the 2020s have nothing on the 1940s and 50s when it comes to young talent. Nothing proves this more than these snapshots of the Diaper Derby, a surprisingly popular annual event that took place in New Jersey's Palisade Park after World War II. The event was sponsored by the National Institute of Diaper Services, and all the victor had to do was cross the finish line first on all fours. To capture the baby's interest, a board loaded with toys was pulled slowly ahead, like a super slow-paced greyhound race. Amazingly, this little-known piece of history has continued into the modern day, with events still being held across the United States. Maybe they'll crawl even faster if we put stripes on them. Operation Baby Lift. Nowadays, many historians view the war in Vietnam as a disastrous military conquest that dragged on far too long. So perhaps the reason this unusual image would be unlikely to appear in the history books is that it depicts an often forgotten, uncharacteristically positive moment in the Vietnam War. Just before the fall of Saigon, after a decade of fighting, President Gerald Ford made the order for over 3,000 infants to be airlifted out of southern Vietnam to safety. The incredible photos from the time show Vietnamese orphans strapped into their cots on their way to be adopted in the US, Australia, and Germany. Some looking very chill indeed. I just hope once they made it there, nobody forced them to enter a diaper derby. Oldschool Goofs. The perception we're given in school of people in Victorian England is one of a very serious society who put etiquette and politeness above all else. Throughout our education, we see unsmiling photos of people in corsets or top hats, but they don't tell the whole truth. Back in the early 19th century, when photography was in its infancy, it took a long time for photographic material to gather enough light to form a visible exposure. Because of this, 15 minutes was considered a quick photo. Being such a slow process, everything was controlled to reduce the chance of ruining a picture, meaning people rarely smiled for photos, as a grin was difficult to maintain for so long. That's why photos like these are so rare, but so eye-opening and showing that even Victorian-era people had a sense of humor. It wouldn't have been easy to hold these silly poses for such a long time, so these people would have needed some serious perseverance. Now that's committing to a joke. Stolen youth. For millennia, the image of the typical soldier has been a fully or mostly fully grown man. So when we're confronted with something that goes against this stereotype, it can be shocking. Near the end of World War II, when the Allies were closing in on Berlin, the German army was stretched extremely thin. So much so that in some instances, Germany's youngest males were the last line of defense. Now, this incredible picture shows two young boys who had been captured in the town of Aachen, speaking to the men they'd been shooting at moments before. This photo wasn't an easy propaganda image to sell to the folks back home. It shows the reality of the desperation war creates and draws into question how culpable the enemy really is. Fidel and Friends. Following a bloody civil war that lasted 5 years, Fidel Castro took control of Cuba in the 1950s, becoming a symbol of revolutionary spirit worldwide, despite his numerous shortcomings. But for the US government, he was a threat to their very way of life. So when Castro made a trip to New York in 1959, you'd have thought security would have been his top priority. But it turns out the military man was on the charm offensive. In an attempt to win over the public, a PR firm had Fidel feeding peanuts to elephants, cuddling American babies and ladies alike, and even munching hot dogs and ice cream. To top it all off, Castro visited school children who adopted his iconic look for the visit. This laid-back, nonchalant public persona couldn't even be broken when there were reports that he had a target on his head. These jovial image of such an infamous enemy of the state were, certainly at the time, something Washington would rather people forgot. D-Day. When you look up World War II in the history books, you'll probably see the usual types of pictures. Flags being hoisted, world leaders surveying maps, buildings covered in flames. But when soldiers weren't fighting on the front lines, they were usually trying to fight off boredom, often by making each other laugh. So when these two American GIs came across a German anti-tank launcher known as a Panzerschreck, they knew just what to do. Some things never change. Whether it's 1944 or 2020, guys will always boast who has the biggest bazooka. Made in China. In America, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, Japanese Americans were relentlessly targeted as accused enemies of the state, usually without any proof of wrongdoing. This involved imprisoning around 120,000 people in concentration camps, but Americans of Japanese ancestry weren't the only ones targeted. Few people are aware of the impact this xenophobic political current had upon the Chinese population of 1940s America. Given the lack of understanding of differences between East Asian racial groups among the American populace, targeted attacks and imprisonment of Chinese Americans became shockingly common. So, some Chinese American citizens took the step of identifying themselves by their race to stop the collateral persecution.
This photo shows two people wearing pins that say China on them in an attempt to maintain their freedom and avoid being attacked.
The history books like to paint the US as the heroes of World War II, and maybe they're right, but it's certainly unnerving to witness a remarkably similar kind of racial persecution happening stateside as the US had been fighting in fascist-occupied Europe. Taliban. Some photos are incredibly striking simply because they challenge what we understand as normal in the present day. For example, when Westerners picture Afghanistan, they usually think of the near constant state of war that's ravaged the country for 4 decades. Since the 80s, Taliban and similar extremist groups have enforced strict Sharia law throughout the country, which has arguably had the largest impact on the lives of Afghan women. Alongside the mandatory burqa, they are forbidden from attending school after the age of 8, leaving the house unattended, and even wearing high heels. With all that considered, it's almost unbelievable that these photos are of the same country. Before the rise of the Taliban, women were free to wear whatever they liked, go where they wanted, and study and work to their heart's content. It's a tragedy to think these liberated women could scarcely have imagined what their daughters and granddaughters would be subjected to. Bathing suitable. Throughout history, fashions have always changed, and certain styles have been deemed too racy for public view. Seaside clothing has long been at the forefront of this argument, and in the 1920s and 30s, people were assigned the specific job of making sure everyone stepped in line. These bizarre photos show policemen and women with nothing better to do enforcing the decency laws of the day. In some instances, it was even a case of making sure the swimsuit matched the precise legal measurements. Feisty women who didn't feel like submitting to this control of their freedoms were promptly escorted from the beaches and sometimes even arrested. With the invention of the bikini in the 1950s, as worn on this Italian beach, tireless lawmen certainly had their work cut out for them, though I'm sure they rarely complained. Another clothed case for the bathing suit inspector. Say sneeze. Experts estimate that every 2 minutes we collectively take the same number of photos as were taken throughout the entire 19th century. But it's not all that surprising, really. To snap a pic back then, you had to hire a photographer who owned their own camera and ensure you looked your best for the special occasion. Unfortunately for this woman, the studio must have been particularly dusty on the day she went to have hers taken. Either that or she had a great sense of humor. Whatever the reason for the sneezing, you may be surprised to learn that this perfectly timed sneeze actually represents cutting-edge technology. In 1900, when the image is thought to have been snapped, camera exposure speeds were finally becoming quick enough to capture happy accidents like these. Because of that, we can enjoy this sneeze in time, 12 decades later. Man down. The Queen of England's guards are almost as iconic as the royal family themselves. Looking like something out of a souvenir shop, these infantrymen stand guard outside of Buckingham Palace all year round. Given their famously unflinching seriousness, this next picture is all the more surprising. In 1970, this member of the Queen's Guard fainted in the sweltering heat during the Queen's birthday parade. It's slightly less surprising though when you consider that the ceremonial helmets worn by the Queen's soldiers are made of real Canadian black bear fur. Over the years, a number of Queen's Guards have collapsed on parade, but few have been as unlucky as the aforementioned soldier of the 70s who took a tumble right under Queen Elizabeth's nose. Marilyn's measurements. The history of underwear has taken a few unusual pit stops, but none more so than bras in the mid-20th century. Believed to have been inspired by the physique of Marilyn Monroe, this bra was popular in the 1950s and 60s. Known as the bullet bra, it was instantly recognizable due to its somewhat conical shape. The style may not have lasted long enough to make it into the textbooks, but it certainly made an impression. Long before Laura Croft, this piece of conical couture was drawing eyes and almost poking them out. Healthy competition. You're probably somewhat familiar with the concept of a beauty pageant, where women are ranked based on, let's be honest, their physical appearance. Well, back in 1930s Britain, there was a competition that was a lot more focused on a single body part. Well, strictly speaking, 2 body parts, and not the ones you're thinking of. These had nothing to do with the bullet bras. These pictures show how women from across the country used to battle it out to see who had, of all things, the prettiest ankles. Even local policemen would get involved, being called upon to adjudicate the competition. Faces were covered to prevent any biases because, heaven forbid, a prettiest ankle contest receive an unfair vote. From boardwalks to ballrooms, people used to flock to these bizarre contests and fall head over heels for women's ankles. Royal range. Queen Elizabeth II is one of the most famous rulers on the planet. She's been on the throne for almost 70 years and is the longest sitting monarch of all time. All those years in the spotlight have resulted in thousands of iconic photos being taken of her. From greeting crowds to strolling with corgis, the history books are spoilt for choice when picking photos of her life. But occasionally, it's possible to stumble upon a remarkably obscure image of her in a setting not many people have seen. There's one such photo that fits this bill better than any. Pictured here firing an L-85 rifle, we are all reminded of the Queen's role as the head of the British military, as she appears to handle it like a pro. I don't know about you, but judging from this photo, I think the Queen's overdue a starring role in the next Rambo movie. Which of these amazing historical photos do you think deserves a place in the school books? Let me know in the comments section below. Thanks for watching.